Hi, I want to talk about Oscar Wilde today. Oscar Wilde, the final, essentially, really, the final author that we're reading from the Victorian age, right? And he is what we call a late Victorian because they do kind of separate themselves from the earlier Victorians. And probably what most separates Wilde is the issue of message. The art for art's sake movement wanted to free art of the burden of morality. That is to say, we didn't want to have to say what you should be thinking or believing. There is, how should I put it, a strain of thought, and this was very prominent throughout most of the Victorian era, that art should be a teacher, like a moral guide. In some ways, it's almost as though art is taking the same role as religion in terms of teaching behaviors, right and wrong. In our experience here in this class, probably the easiest example to understand is Elizabeth Barrett Browning in her verse novel, Aurora Leigh. Now remember, we read a small portion of Aurora Leigh, small but long enough. And in the portion that we read, one of the things that comes through is the approval and disapproval of certain things. For example, the education of Aurora, young Aurora in England, okay? And we kind of talked about this in relationship to Mary Wollstonecraft, right? And her writings about the poor education of women. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning really illustrates what a poor education this was for a young woman in England at that time. It's pretty hard not to get the message. It's about as subtle as a 2x4 hitting your forehead, right? It's just whack. There you are, okay? In America, right, we had similar ideas. For instance, early in the 19th century, before the Civil War, right, we had a novel that was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was overtly an anti-slavery novel, right? It was, in fact, very influential, one could argue, in terms of coalescing ideas, especially in the North, against slavery. But does that make it a good novel? Oscar Wilde would argue no, not by itself. In other words, having a message, even if it's a message we agree with, is not necessarily something that makes for a positive experience of art. What makes for a positive experience of art? Beauty. Art should be about the production of the beautiful, whether it's in painting, music, literature, what have you. So when we look at preface to the picture of Dorian Gray, while on the one hand it seems light and humorous, and of course Oscar Wilde is a writer who is known for writing these kind of very funny lines that are often quoted with a lot of inversions in them, unexpected directions, right? He, is certainly one of the most quoted authors in the English language because of that. But underneath that humorous exterior is a very serious proposition. Okay, so when we look at preface to the picture of Dorian Gray, what we want to see is what he's really saying here. And what he's saying is he wants to free art of this duty, this obligation, if you will, to send a message, to be a moral guide of some sort. Right? He doesn't want it to be a moral guide. What he wants is it to be an experience of beauty. Okay. Now, where we stand right here in the 21st century, we might say, oh yeah, those Victorians, how horrible they were, ruining the art with messages, right? But don't be so quick to judge. In the 20th and then into the 21st century, we still have a lot of discussion on these very similar kinds of terms. For example, the book banning issue. Why do some people want to ban books in public libraries and in school libraries? Why do they want to ban these books? Because they have messages that they disagree with. Okay. So we are still very often, in fact, in an environment where we have a discussion of literature, art, music, where people say, well, this promotes positive values or this promotes negative values. Wilde wants to step away from that question, those two questions, or those weren't questions, those were statements, sorry. He wants to step away from all of that and say, screw it. I don't care whether it's a positive value or a negative value. I just want the experience of the art. Right? He's not saying I want to push the positive agenda that I have, right? What he's saying is I want to have the experience of the beautiful. That's what art should be about. Okay, and if you look at the preface, and he talks about what the beautiful is, and obviously there's a lot of subjectivity within that, but the point is he wants to free it from this burden. He doesn't want to be like Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Harriet Beecher Stowe and say, okay, now here's the message of my story. Here's the lesson I want you to learn. Here's what I want you to carry forward. He doesn't want the experience of art to be a political one. He doesn't want it to be about what we would nowadays call social activism or social justice. He doesn't want any of that. He wants the art to be free to go in whatever direction it goes. Because that is what makes beautiful art. Okay. Now, part of the argument is that people are the agents of moral and immoral behavior, right? So, that goes back to an argument that we've seen, oh gosh, for a very long time. Does art in whatever form promote real life behavior, right? Whether it's video games, movies, music. I think in our country, here in the United States, in the early days of the movie industry, because of concerns of this very sort, there was something created called the Hays Code. And the Hays Code was basically a series of do's and don'ts for the movie industry. It basically, in summary, promoted positive family values, to coin a phrase. So, it's not that you couldn't have bad characters doing bad things, but they would be punished in some meaningful way, right? They would either be killed or locked up, eventually brought to justice of some kind. That nobody could do anything bad and get away with it scot-free, right? The crime would never go unpunished. And sex, oh my God, don't even go there, right? Even between consenting adults, even married adults, forget about it, right? So, for instance, like in the early days of TV, which is not quite covered by the Hays Code, but it's still a nice illustration. In the early days of TV, married couples on shows would actually have twin beds. The married couple wouldn't even be sleeping in the same bed. That really screwed me up as a kid. Well, looking at that on TV and then seeing my parents in the same bed, it's like, what kind of perverts are my parents, right? Ooh. You couldn't have kisses that lasted longer than 3 seconds. If some character was lying in bed, the other character had to have at least 1 foot firmly on the ground. All right, you can't have 2 characters in the same bed at the same time, that kind of thing, right? And all this was predicated on this general idea of keeping the entertainment clean so that people would not be, influenced to do immoral things, whatever that immorality was. Right? So we should not look down our nose at the Victorians that Oscar Wilde is rejecting and say, oh yes, Wilde had it right and the Victorians were all wrong. Look at our own time. We're still doing this. I mean, we are literally in this time still talking about banned books. We're still, we have a rating systems on our movies. Right? Now, granted, the movies are way beyond what they used to be, and the Hays Code is no longer in force. The Hays Code is generations gone. But still, we still have the rating systems. We have ratings on video games, TV shows. We have music that has been labeled, with expletives and stuff like that. You have to put a label on there, an advisory. Oftentimes, of course, it's aimed at children. That's kind of the big thing. Oh, we don't want our kids exposed to this. But it's not too far to go from getting the kids exposed to getting adults exposed, because that's, again, people are making this argument that the exposure to these kinds of things in art will lead to real life consequences, right? I mean, that's basically the argument. Obviously, Wilde is living long before video games and many of these other forms that we have today. But the point is still the same. The point that he wants to make is, no, people are good or bad, right? Not books. Books are well written or badly written, that's all. It's people who behave in moral ways or immoral ways, not the book, okay? Think of it this way. If you're like almost any other person in this country alive today, can you imagine how many killings, fictional killings, you've been exposed to through media, TV, and so forth? Right? Video games just blasting people away. Arguably, even just a young adult has probably been exposed to tens of thousands of killings. Does this make you more likely to be a killer? Are you a killer? Well, if you are, please don't tell me. But that's the idea, right? Now, this is a controversial thing, right? Because a lot of people say, no, art has a duty, right, to promote certain values. Now, those values may change over time that people think ought to be valued and pushed forward, but nevertheless, that is one train of thought, right? On the other hand, as I said, is the train of thought that says, no, art should be liberated from this duty. Don't tell me I have to have a story where good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. Don't tell me I have to have a story that promotes the positive values that you have in your mind, right? Whether it's something that is within the culture, the society, the religion, whatever. Wilde says, no. Art for art's sake means it's all about the beauty. It doesn't have to have a positive message. It doesn't have to have a message of any kind. Just enjoy it. That's all. Just enjoy it.